Subtle results, still you, but with fewer lines. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I discuss crimes committed by military members and veterans. But don't worry, you don't have to know anything about the military to listen, I promise. You just have to be a true crime enthusiast, and if that's you, welcome to my family. And in this family, we are all a part of the True Crime Army, so don't worry, all services are accepted. Today, I'm doing things a little bit different. I am bringing you a throwback case, a remastered edition of my very first Military Murder podcast episode. Yep, we're going back to Germany circa the 90s. But I'm doing this for a few reasons. I've changed the format of my show a little bit since starting a few years ago. Back in the day, I used to have background music and sound effects and the whole nine. But so many people found the extras overwhelming and distracting. So at some point in my podcasting career, right around the 50 episode mark, I got a better mic, I axed the background music, and I went straight to voice-only storytelling. And I have always wanted to re-record some of the most popular military murder podcast episodes. So here we are. Also, I have had a tremendous growth in listeners since I first started a few years ago. And so many of you newbies haven't gone back to listen to some of the OG military murder episodes, which if you haven't done that, you are truly missing out. Seriously, I covered some classics when I first started. So in order to entice you to go back and listen, because seriously, go back and listen from episode 1, I figured I would bring it back to the roots of military murder. But for today's story, I may have never actually started researching military murder cases. The script for this episode has not changed from the first time I put this out, but at the end, I have included some listener comments about this case, and I will even be reading you 2 or 3 very special emails that I got from listeners who experienced this case firsthand. Stay tuned for those because they are nuts. All right, friends, join me today as I tell you the tragic story of a love triangle out of Fulda, Germany that quite literally caused someone to lose their head for love or lust. Now, let's dig in.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Our story begins with Stephen, who went by Steve. Steve was the oldest of 6 kids, and he had a strong Catholic upbringing. And he was a very smart kid. He participated in gifted and talented programs, and he was named Student of the Year his senior year of high school. He wasn't a problem child at all. In fact, Steve was someone you could look up to. Like 50% of other families, when he was 14 years old, his parents divorced. And this really sucked for Steve. He realized how much families suffered from divorce. And unlike most kids who might just give up on love before even dating, he just realized that he would be one of the few that would try to make love work, regardless of the bad times. I envision him as a hopeless romantic, once he got the girl, there was nothing that could ever separate them. It's kind of cute, but kind of stalkerish at the same time. But more on that later. In the late 90s, Steve went to college and studied English and psychology. Spring break his senior year, he met the girl of his dreams. It was a woman named Diane, and they hit it off quickly. Later that spring of '89, he graduated from college and went to work in the family business. After 6 months of dating, Steve and Diane got married in a small private ceremony. The first year of marriage appears, from all the reporting, to have been heaven, and they soon began to make plans to expand the family. Listen, although baby planning is fun for new couples, things don't always go as planned, and as we all know too well, some couples have a hard time maintaining viable pregnancies. Well, Diane suffered 3 very rough miscarriages in a very short period of time, each loss requiring a hospital stay. After the 3rd miscarriage, Diane told Steve that she was getting her tubes tied to reduce the suffering. She just couldn't handle losing another baby. It was physically and emotionally destroying her. Steve was devastated. You see, he always knew he wanted a family. His perfect plan was to have 2 biological kids and to adopt 2 more kids after that. But he loved Diane too much to see her broken. So instead of allowing Diane to feel any further pain by allowing her to get her tubes tied, he decided he would be the one to get a vasectomy, and he went through with it. He was only 23 years old at the time. Now, many people say that this is crazy, but that's how much he loved Diane. Steve's family was shocked that he would take such drastic measures, especially because they knew he was such a great family man, and all he ever talked about was raising a family. But Steve knew his dream of being a dad was not over because they could always adopt. And to be honest, Steve loved Diane so much he didn't want to see her in pain anymore. But what Steve didn't know at the time was that by this point, the cracks in his young marriage were just beginning to emerge. During this time in the young relationship, Steve decided the family business was not for him, and he decided he wanted to give the military a good old try. Even though he had a college degree and was offered the opportunity to become a military officer, he declined and decided to enlist instead. In 1991, Steve Schap joined the Army as a private and went off to basic training. In 1992, his first duty station was Sickles Army Air Base in Fulda, Germany. Steve naively thought that by joining the Army, he would be able to spend more time with his wife. But military life is hard AF. And oftentimes, military life is lonely, and it requires families to undergo prolonged periods of separation, and usually one half of the couple is off cheating. Yes, it's a hard truth. It's a reality. Anyway, Diane was already having a hard time keeping the spark between her and her husband alive. But in this moment, even though she kind of wanted to just get rid of Steve, not get rid of him, but she wanted to divorce him, she figured, okay, maybe this move across the Atlantic can help save our marriage. Which is a little bit funny because if you think about you're moving thousands of miles away from your family to be with someone who you don't even have a spark with anymore, it just doesn't really make sense. The young couple made friends while in Germany and everything seemed to be going well. Friendships were blossoming, life was good. Like in most military communities, the first people you often become friends with are your neighbors and your coworkers, those who are in close proximity to you on a daily basis. So that's what happened in March of 1993 when Steve became friends with specialist Gregory Glover during air assault school. Greg was a single, handsome fella, but he hung out with Steve and Diane, having dinner, listening to music. He even helped plan Thanksgiving dinner with Steve, Diane, and another couple that year. So he was kind of like the 3rd or the 5th wheel. In addition to making friends, Diane took a volunteer position at the base legal office in order to keep herself occupied. In the fall of 1993, Steve, now a sergeant in the Army, which is an E5, was picked up for a 4-week military class in the States, and Diane stayed behind in Germany. Diane and Steve continued to communicate over snail mail, because remember, this is the 90s, while he was in the States, and the relationship seemed to be strong, at least in Steve's eyes. He returned after his TDY and had no idea that his marriage was quickly falling apart. On Thanksgiving Day, soon after this 4-week TDY separation, Diane told Steve that she was unhappy and she wanted out of the marriage. She wanted a divorce. Steve was completely shocked, and he couldn't believe his ears. How could she want a divorce? According to him, everything was great in their relationship. Diane tried to tell Steve that she was unhappy, but he wasn't having it. He didn't listen to anything she said. He didn't want a divorce, and he swore that he would never get divorced. You see, as I told you earlier, Steve was still traumatized by his parents' divorce, and he would not hear one more word. If you're married and never been through a divorce, the concept of getting a divorce is probably foreign to you. But if you've ever been through a divorce, it's crazy to think that someone can say, I don't want a divorce, and then you're like trapped in that marriage, right? By early December, Diane was beginning to feel real cooped up, and she needed a well-deserved girls' trip. She didn't need to convince Steve too much that she wanted to go away with the girls, and off she went. Steve made nothing of it, but in her absence, he began to snoop around her things because he had a suspicious feeling that his wife was not being completely honest with him. And guess what? While snooping, he found what he was looking for. He found her diary. Which, listen up, y'all. Really, if you are going to go around snooping, be prepared for what you're going to find. And maybe make some distance between you and your spouse if you start snooping and find something, because it's not nice, especially not in this case. And I know you're probably thinking there's no way that a wife would be crazy enough to ever write anything about another man or an affair in a diary. And if you thought this, you would be wrong, my friend. I haven't been able to find the pages of the diary, but apparently what she wrote in there was enough evidence for Steve to quickly confront his wife upon her return from her girls' trip. And Diane was beyond herself. How dare he accuse her of cheating? No way! She wasn't cheating. She used her diary as an outlet to write down her fantasies and nothing more. Yeah, she really wanted a divorce because she was lonely and unhappy so far away from home. But there was no other man in her life, she told Steve. Because listen, there really is no difference between a cheater and a liar. For whatever reason, everything that Diane said, I'm sure she cried and cried and cried. Well, it seemed to appease Steve, and he quickly dropped the subject. The following day, they met with a counselor, and Steve ultimately decided a divorce was probably best. Diane then began to make plans to return to the U.S. And I think at this point is where Steve realized that keeping someone hostage in a marriage they don't want to be in is worse than divorce. Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns, and April is Financial Literacy Month, an entire month dedicated to taking control of your money. Because honestly, no one really taught me how to manage money growing up. I didn't learn about investing until I was well into adulthood. But what I love about Acorns is that it makes it easy to start saving and investing for your future in just 5 minutes. I know, April is an entire month, but you don't need an entire month to learn. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns recommends a diversified portfolio that matches you and your goals. You can start with just your spare change. And you don't need a lot of time. Setup takes just 5 minutes because I know that your time is precious. And if financial wellness has ever felt out of reach, Acorns makes it simple, giving your money a chance to grow without the overwhelm. Personally, using Acorns gave me the confidence to stop putting it off and just start. And that peace of mind is completely worth it. Sign up now and join over 14 million all-time customers who've already saved and invested over $25 billion with a B dollars with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/militarymama or download the Acorns app to get started today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/militarymama.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel? Or that white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
December 7th was a typical day, but what Steve and Diane did not know when they woke up that morning was that someone would be dead by the end of the day, and one of them would be the main suspect. Steve woke up, put on his uniform, and went to work. Typical routine. Diane woke up and was getting ready to go to the bank when she suddenly began to bleed. Oh no, Diane thought. She quickly went to the hospital to get everything checked out. While at the hospital, she phoned a coworker at the legal office. She asked him to give someone a message, someone who was not her husband. The coworker was a little bit confused, like, wait, you want me to tell so-and-so that you're in the hospital? And Diane was like, yes. But what about your husband, the coworker thought. Do you want me to tell him that you're in the hospital too? Diane then quickly said, yeah, sure, let him know I'm here too. The call ended, and the coworker was not quite sure what to think about the situation. But it was none of his business. He was just the messenger. Later that afternoon, Steve got the message and he made a beeline to check on Diane. He thought she was having complications from ovarian cysts as she had had in the past. He got there around 2:20 p.m. Upon entering the hospital, Diane did not look good. She looked like she had a lot on her mind. She seemed apprehensive. Steve thought the worst, but Diane said, listen, I'm fine. But she did have a confession for Steve. Steve looked at her, wondering what kind of confession she would make to him at the hospital. Diane then dropped a bomb on him. She told him she was pregnant. Steve was confused. How could she be pregnant? He had a vasectomy a few years prior. As if not wanting to lose her courage, she quickly confessed, it's not your baby. I had an affair. What the what? Steve could not believe his ears. But instead of flying into a fit of rage, he was surprisingly calm. He didn't care that Diane had an affair. He didn't care who the father was. He only cared that she and the baby were okay. I imagine that what Steve was feeling in this moment was the actual rug being ripped right from underneath him. And the thing is that Steve's lack of a reaction didn't really surprise Diane, since he had just agreed to give her a divorce. She told him that she was fine and that the baby was fine. Steve at that point was being kind, and he asked her if she needed anything from the house for her hospital stay. Diane said yes, and Steve left at 3 p.m. I imagine that at this point, Diane was probably beginning to think that she was about to begin a new chapter in her life. And you know what? She wouldn't be wrong. About an hour after he left the hospital, Steve returned in civilian clothes, but this time he was not the sweet, concerned man who left earlier. This time at the hospital, he was a pissed off, irate husband who demanded an explanation. Who was the father? How could she do this? Did they have sex in his house, on his bed, in his shower? He wanted answers. Diane was sitting in her hospital bed and she couldn't give him any answers. Not because she didn't know them, but just because she didn't want to. But she did tell him one thing that I think upset him very much. She told him that they did have sex in their house, but that she and the guy that she was having an affair with had sex on a blanket on the floor. They didn't do it on the bed. Lies! This information, of course, only made Steve angry. He was sick to his stomach imagining the love of his life with another man in his house after he got a vasectomy, even though he wanted a bunch of kids. So, of course, he pressed her again. Who was the father? Who was the father? Who was the father? But Diane didn't answer. Then Steve cleverly began to interrogate his wife. Okay. So he asked her, was the father a senior official? If so, he told her he needed to know because this affair could affect his career. Diane assured Steve that it wasn't a senior official. Okay, Steve said, was it a non-commissioned officer of my equal rank? If so, this could also make it difficult for me. Diane assured Steve that it wasn't, and she would not do anything to hurt his career. Oh, Steve thought out loud. So it's a specialist, huh? And Diane finally said yes. Immediately, Steve burst out of the hospital telling Diane there was no point in continuing the conversation. He needed to go pack because he couldn't stay in the apartment any longer, especially considering that she betrayed him right there in their home. Diane just cried and cried and cried. Things weren't going as she planned, and the worst was yet to come. As Steve exited the hospital, he knew exactly who his wife was having an affair with. He went to the base and began to look for the lover. He found the dorm where the lover allegedly lived and began to hunt. Acting normal, Steve asked a soldier near the dorms if they knew where he was, and they pointed to the phone booth right across the street. Meanwhile, while Steve was looking for Diane's lover, her hospital phone rang and it was her boyfriend, Specialist Gregory. Yes. You see, when Steve was back in the U.S. for his class, Greg continued to visit with Diane. And although in the beginning the relationship was platonic, one thing led to another and they became intimate. Diane found out she was pregnant in October. She and Greg were both super excited and they began to think about their future. Greg was getting transferred to North Carolina in mid-December, and Diane was eager to return to the U.S. to find a job. The thing is that Greg and Diane even talked about marriage, but she had a huge problem. She was still married to Steve. But this was soon going to be a non-issue, since Steve had finally agreed to grant her a divorce. The relationship between Diane and Greg was so sneaky that when Diane went on her girls' trip, she snuck away for an entire night to spend it with Greg. And remember, Greg even helped plan the Thanksgiving get-together. But let's not forget, when Diane was confronted immediately after the girls' trip, she lied her rear off. Greg received Diane's message, and at 5:15, he went over to the phone booth to call Diane. She told him all about her day, informed him that she didn't tell Steve that he was the baby's father, and assured him that although she was bleeding, the baby was going to be okay. Greg admitted that earlier in the day, Steve had given him a ride and confided in him that she wanted a divorce and that he had found her journal with a list of names of men she had slept with. The phone booth conversation lasted between 5 and 10 minutes. And then, all of a sudden, Greg told Diane, "Your husband's here." And within seconds, the phone went silent. Diane had no idea what happened or the horrors she would later learn, or better yet, later see. As the phone hung in the air back at the phone booth, Greg was engaged in a battle for his life. Steve had showed up and he was past the point of wanting an explanation. In the phone booth, Steve attacked Greg with an 8-inch double-edged survival knife, but his initial strikes only created superficial wounds. I'm assuming because Greg was able to block it. The two men were now outside of the dining facility and Greg's roommate heard the screams. Greg was able to escape the death trap in the phone booth, but he tripped over the wet cobblestones and fell to the ground. Steve gained the superior position after the fall and attempted to pin Greg's hands with his knees in an effort to immobilize Greg. Greg fought valiantly for his life. Greg's roommate heard the screams. The roommate went to the window and saw Greg and another man in a brawl, almost like they were wrestling on the floor. But he quickly saw Greg was no longer moving and had blood all over his face. The roommate saw the man hacking at Greg's neck. Other witnesses described Steve's actions as, quote, cutting meat or skinning a deer, end quote. Another witness described Steve as sawing at the victim's head. Then Steve stood up and began to kick Greg's head, when all of a sudden Greg's head detached from his body and rolled a good 10 to 15 feet. Meanwhile, other witnesses yelled for Steve to stop and others yelled for someone to call the police. Steve was as nonchalant as ever. He walked over to the head, picked it up by the hair, looked at it, and no kidding said, "This is what you get for being an adulterer." He then tucked it under his arm like a football. Steve continued to walk towards his car and then smugly said, quote, "and he said he was sorry," end quote, and then let out a chuckle. The witnesses had just seen one of the most brutal murders ever, and Steve was just walking away to his car with a head. But the horror was still not over.
Saturday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Saturday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Saturday. Saturday, bring it on.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. 3 couples, 4 vacations, a lot to unpack. Watch The 4 Seasons, a new series starring comedy favorites Tina Fey, Steve Carell, Will Forte, Coleman Domingo, and more in a hilarious and heartfelt love letter to long-term relationships. Based on the original Alan Alda film. Watch The 4 Seasons, streaming now only on Netflix.
30 minutes after the call with her lover went silent, Diane was still in the dark about what occurred back on base, when all of a sudden she heard heavy footsteps coming towards her room, and she recognized them as her husband's. Steve then walked straight into her room with blood all over his clothing and his face. He then laid a bag down and grabbed Greg's head with both hands and shoved the head in Diane's face. Diane was screaming bloody murder. She had no idea what was happening. Was this a joke? Was this a prank? What was happening? Steve then put the head down on the nightstand next to the bed. Steve made sure that Greg's head was facing Diane, and almost as if out of a movie script and rehearsed a million times, Steve looked at Diane and said, "Look, Diane, Greg's here. He'll sleep with you every night, only you won't sleep at night because all you'll see is this," end quote. After hearing the screams down the hall, a doctor walked in and saw the scene unfolding. She quickly left to call police. Meanwhile, other doctors ran into the room and saw what could only be described as a scene from a horror flick. Steve told the doctors to close the door and take a seat. He wanted them to hear his story, and he asked them to remember as much as possible. He also demanded a bucket of water to wash his hands. These doctors must have been petrified. They were not sure what this madman would do next. Would they become his next victims? By this point, though, Steve appeared to be lucid, calm, and oriented. He began to wash the blood off his hands in the bucket. Soon, the doctors realized that Steve was just interested in being heard. Steve confided in them that his wife had humiliated him by having an affair with his friend. But Steve was no idiot. Not only did she have an affair with his friend, she had affairs with many other men as well. Steve also told them that he learned how to disconnect a head from a body. Quote, "You gave me enough clues. It was easy enough to figure out. I'm not normally a violent man. This is my only violent act, but don't underestimate me. I'm skilled at what I do. I studied this. I planned this. I calculated this. I did this for you. I love you," end quote. That's sick. That's so sick, y'all. As Steve spoke, he would look at his wife and then at the lifeless head on the nightstand. I'm imagining that at this moment, Steve cannot believe that the man he called a confidant, the friend who he leaned on when his marriage was struggling the most, the friend he shared his marital struggles with, could betray him this way. And now he paid the ultimate price. Steve was on a roll, though, and he continued to talk. When Diane asked him about Greg's body and the knife, Steve replied, quote, "I'm not that stupid. I don't care if they put me in jail for the rest of my life because I'll just think about you. And I don't care if they put me to sleep, if they kill me, because I'll just think about you while they do it," end quote. One of the doctors attempted to cover the head with a rag or a blanket or something, but Steve wouldn't allow it because he wanted Diane to continue to see the gruesomeness of her actions. Then he waited peacefully for the police to arrive. He told the doctors, quote, "I want to speak to the military police." And once they arrived, Steve told one police officer, quote, "My wife should not have done what she did, but I should not have done what I did either, but I'll pay the price," end quote. Steve was cooperative during the investigation. He pointed police officers to his car where they found a backpack with clothes, food, his passport, a copy of Diane's diary entry, and a briefcase with personal files. Ironically enough, the bag that Steve used to transport Greg's head had the word head on it. When I read this in a news article, I was confused. But my best friend Google informed me that Head, H-E-A-D, is an athletic apparel company. They specialize in tennis, swimming, skiing, and other sports. But come on, man, can this story get any more fiction-like? Well, hold your horses, friends, because it does get more crazy from a legal standpoint. Back at the base, they found Greg's headless body outside the dining facility, and inside the phone booth, they found Greg's wallet and his cover. Upon further investigation back at Steve's house, they found a picture book about knives and knife fighting, a booklet titled Everyone's Knife Bible, and a pamphlet titled Your Silent Partner, which was knife-oriented. At the time of the murder, Steve and Diane were both 26 years old. Gregory Glover was only 21 years old, y'all. Because the murder took place on the military base, the military had jurisdiction in the case, and therefore Steve faced a general court-martial, which is the same thing as a felony-level trial for premeditated murder. The trial took place at the end of March and through early April of '94. The jury consisted of 4 officers and 3 non-commissioned officers, 6 men and only 1 woman. Prior to the trial, a sanity board was ordered to ensure that Steve was sane to stand trial and to make sure that he could appreciate the severity of his crime when he was committing it. Part of this evaluation consisted of a total of 15 hours of interviews with Steve. The final report indicated that Steve was sane to stand trial. At the general court-martial, Steve's defense team argued that the killing was not premeditated, but instead was a spontaneous outburst of rage, similar to heat of passion. The defense was hoping for a voluntary manslaughter conviction instead of a premeditated murder conviction. But the jury didn't agree, and they convicted Steve of premeditated murder. So I wanted to talk about this briefly. I mean, he told Diane that, quote, he planned this. What the heck did he mean that he planned this? Did he know she was cheating? I mean, he found the diary. He probably didn't believe any of her lies. But did he know who it was right away? And whoever it was that she was cheating on, was he planning on just committing a horrific crime like the one he did? Or was his rage much greater once he found out that not only was she cheating with his BFF, but, and this is the big but here, she was pregnant? You have to wonder, can someone's rage just cause them to hack someone's neck and then take the head with him? The trial lasted over a week, and of course, there were many witnesses to the murder. Many witnesses at the hospital who interacted with both Diane and Steve after the murder, and there were a handful of Steve's co-workers who testified that he was the sharpest soldier they had ever met. The most interesting information I found in my research was a sworn witness statement from Greg's commander at the time of his death. I'm going to call him Lieutenant Colonel N. Lieutenant Colonel N stated that he did not tolerate adultery in the unit because he felt that adultery divided the troops, and he further informed everyone that there would be serious consequences for adultery. It is unclear if Greg was scheduled to be promoted before he died, but Lieutenant Colonel N did not posthumously promote Greg specifically because of his affair with Diane. He said his affair was, quote, not consistent with the honor of the U.S. Army, end quote. And this I found in a European Stars and Stripes article dated 1 April 1994. Another piece of testimony that I found compelling was a testimony of Diane's coworker, the messenger who was to tell Greg that she was in the hospital. This messenger testified that when he passed along the message to Greg, the veins in Greg's head began to pulse. Greg looked shaky and was very nervous. This was new information to me because I thought the entire time that maybe Greg didn't know what hit him. But it turned out that Greg, the victim, probably knew he was in a world of hurt. He just didn't realize the extent of Steve's anger. And I wonder if he would have known how angry Steve was if he would have protected himself better at the phone booth, although I'm not sure that he really had a way to get away. During the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury heard from Steve for the first time, and this was in the form of an unsworn statement. Steve described the day of the murder as an out-of-body experience. He said that as he approached Greg in that phone booth, he felt physically incapacitated. He got tunnel vision. He told the jury that he didn't feel like himself, almost like he was watching the entire scene unfold in a movie. And he also said that as he was killing Greg, like actively killing Greg with a knife, his victim no longer seemed like Greg. He felt Greg's presence actually disappear. For whatever reason, the jury took mercy on Steve during the sentencing phase of the trial. Even though premeditated murder carried a mandatory life sentence, the jury recommended leniency in the prison sentence. So I'm about to get real nerdy with you on some military terms for a few minutes, but this part is very important in this story, and so just listen up. In the military, years back, the General Court-Martial Convening Authority, basically the commanding general officer of the base, the person who ordered the case to begin with, well, this person had one last look at the entire record of trial, and this general officer had to quote unquote sign off on the conviction and the sentence. Well, back in the day, while reviewing any case, the general who was responsible for it could decide to independently set aside a conviction completely and wipe the person's record clean or they could grant clemency in the form of a reduced prison sentence. And there's so many other things that could be done. In this way, the military justice system was different than civilian cases back in the day. In the civilian sector, prosecutors make a charging decision. Will this person face a trial or not? In the military, senior military commanders made that decision back in the day, albeit with the advice of their judge advocate. And even after a case has gone to trial, the General Court-Martial Convening Authority, aka the general, could still choose to wipe the conviction clear after a jury has convicted someone. So in the present case that we're talking about today, Steve and Schap, although premeditated murder called for a mandatory life sentence, the sentence wasn't final until the general reviewed the case file. So, are you ready for this? In this case, the jurors felt so much sympathy for Steve that they requested a reduced sentence. 5 of the 7 jurors requested clemency in the form of 30 years in prison instead of life. So, I don't think I explained this last time. He got mandatory life sentence. Like that was what the UCMJ called for. Like you're going to get a mandatory life sentence. But these 5 additional jurors said to the General Court-Martial Convening Authority, basically through the Area Defense Council, that he, or I think it was a he at the time, should grant this guy clemency in the form of reducing his sentence from mandatory to 30 years. And that means that he would be eligible for parole. The 6th juror asked that Steve and Schap get no more than 20 years, and only one of the jurors, which was the jury president, did not request clemency. This person felt that mandatory life meant mandatory life. And so I wonder which one it was, because it was 6 men and 1 woman. And then it was 4 officers and 3 enlisted. So very interesting case. So that's what they recommended. The general still had the ability to do whatever he pleased. For reasons that we will never know, but I guess we can speculate, the General Court-Martial Convening Authority in Stephen's case reduced his prison sentence from mandatory life in prison to 45 years. And I got this information from a European Stars and Stripes article dated 15 June 1994. Just to note that changes in the law in the recent years have extremely limited a General Court-Martial Convening Authority's ability to set aside a conviction and reduce sentences in serious crimes. And even more recently, since I released this case in 2019, in a few years or like in a few months, we're going to be moving from a jury being able to decide on a sentence to basically just judge alone sentences, which will lead to more consistent sentencing for the military across all the branches and across all the bases, which is actually really interesting. A side fact, but something interesting about the jury in this case, during the same time frame of this investigation and trial, another Sickles Air Base Army soldier pled guilty to unpremeditated murder for the killing of his 1-year-old daughter. In that case, which I was able to find very little facts, the father beat his little girl and then threw her out the 4th-story window. The jury sentenced the soldier to life in prison, but due to a plea agreement with the convening authority, that man was only sentenced to 40 years in prison. And get this, 4 of the 7 jury members who sat on the baby murder jury also sat on Steve's jury. So once the military implements this military judge-only sentencing, we won't have cases like this. Because imagine to have a military member serve on a murder jury at all in their lifetime in the military is rare. But to serve in 2 murder cases, like one being like the brutal murder of a child, a 1-year-old, a baby basically, and the decapitation of a soldier in front of the DFAC. Imagine the pictures that they had to see for both of those cases. That could be pretty traumatizing. And those service members, I'm sure, suffered severely from PTSD. So that last bit had me wondering, do you think that the child killing in the previous soldier's case was so brutal that it made the facts in the gruesome, headless, adulterous case seem less egregious? I personally think so, at least for those 4 jury members. But I would love to hear from all of you. Final note about this case before I move on to comments that I've received since 2019 when I first released this episode. I looked up Steve to see his whereabouts, and according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons website, Steve was released on parole on April 5th, 2017, after serving a little over 23 years of his 45-year sentence. He is currently in his late 50s. I couldn't find conclusive open source information on Diane's current whereabouts, and I didn't look for them since 2019, or even what happened with the baby. But if she went on to have a successful pregnancy, which I'm sure she did, Greg and Diane's baby is currently in their 30s. And also, I'm not sure that I said this at all during my telling of this episode, but when Diane had to testify at the court-martial, she was like full-blown pregnant. So I can only imagine how Stephen Schap felt when she showed up to court to testify, like just fully blown pregnant. It's actually, I don't know. All right. And so the interesting thing about this case is that it was my first case that I ever put out on November 11th, 2019. And, my podcast is all about people who want to hear about military cases that happen. You may have heard about them when you first got to a base or when you were leaving a base, didn't know how it finished out or all the kind of details. And that's why I started this show. And the crazy thing is that from episode 1 until episode 200 or whatever that I have already put out, True Crime Army rule number 1 remains the same. Divorce is always better than murder. Always. I don't need to explain this one, but really save yourself decades in jail and just sign the dang divorce papers. Seriously, and then go to therapy. For real. It doesn't matter if you have an amicable divorce, if there is adultery in your divorce, if there is everything went well in your divorce. Therapy really helps because if you don't do it, you'll just bring in your old problems into your new relationship. So therapy. I know, I sound like a broken record. But listen, let's keep this rule in our back pocket because I have a feeling that even in the last 200 cases and even in the future 200, 400, 600 cases of Military Murder Podcast, we will hear about this True Crime Army rule come up again and again. So with that concludes this episode. Now, let's move on to some comments that I have received in the last few years. One of the comments on my YouTube video for this is this. It says, moral of the story, don't cheat on your soldier husband, which I guess is the same thing as divorce is better than murder, maybe? I don't know. And someone else wrote, to sort of quote Chris Rock, I'm not saying he should have killed him, but I understand. Many others in the comments section remembered being stationed at Sickles Airfield. Pharaoh Jonez was one of the ones who was very upset at Diane. And this person wrote, quote, but did she not humiliate him? Did she not embarrass him? Great breakdown, but you make it seem as if Steve was some monster, while 100% dismissing the actions of what his wife did. This was horrid on her behalf. I don't feel bad for her. Nobody deserves to die in that manner. But this is why you don't play with people like that. And another rule should be, don't cheat on your husband with one of his coworkers and best friend and get pregnant. Okay, so this comment by Pharaoh Jones got a lot more comments. Someone responded to this person saying, okay, so one of your proposed rules is to leave the child fatherless? To which the original poster wrote, not my point. Someone else pointed out the betrayal here. Steve got the vasectomy to protect Diane, but she was out having unprotected sex with other dudes, not even protecting herself. Shane Hollander wrote, never ever trust a man or a woman who cheats on their spouse. If they will betray the person who should be the closest and most significant person in their life, they will betray you. All right, so I've heard this before from other people. What do you guys think about that? Because that is really, really deep. So let's move on to some of the emails that I received. I received a few emails related specifically to this case. So I got an email from someone who said that they did the casualty report on Gregory Glover. The person went on to say, quote, those CID photos still haunt me today, end quote. This person also said that Steve used a Swiss Army knife during his crime. Of course, there is no way for me to confirm this, but I just wanted to relay the message from my listener. Then I have personal emails from soldiers who experienced life in Fulda and were witnesses to the case. I got an email from a former soldier who wanted to recommend a case out of Fort Campbell, which, by the way, I will be covering that case shortly. It's the Taco Bell murders. But this soldier told me that prior to arriving at Fort Campbell, he was assigned in Germany to T Troop 411 ACR, and he said he was an eyewitness to Greg's murder. He also went on to say that a month prior to Greg's murder, he was aware that Specialist Ricard, also T Troop, killed his 1-year-old daughter while he was drunk. He said that that soldier tried to cover up the baby's death by claiming she was playing by the window and fell out the 5th-story apartment window. And that's the case that I talked about during the episode. The soldier who wrote into me said he was one of the soldiers who had to escort Ricard to Mannheim, which is where they hold military inmates pending court-martial. So basically, they're not military inmates, but they're pretrial. They're people who are pretrial confinement or on the way back to the States to be confined in the States. But listen, y'all, the craziest of all messages I received was from a person who said he was one of the last people to see Gregory Glover alive at the phone booth. I received this email 2 years after releasing this episode, and the email goes like this. It's pretty lengthy, but it's so insane. Wow, just stumbled on this podcast. I was stationed at Sickles Army Airfield 91 to 93 till the base was shut down. This really brought back memories. I have actually told people this story before because it is so unbelievable. This unit, the 411th ACR, was one of the best units I experienced in my military career. I made some great friends that I'll always remember and had some of the best times of my life while living in Fulda. At the time of this incident, only a few of those friends were still there, as the base was shutting down. I was one of the last people to see Glover alive. At the time, I was maybe 20 years old and I was on the phone. It was a yellow phone booth. I was talking to my German girlfriend when Glover walked up. As a typical courtesy, I told my girlfriend I had to get off to let Glover use the phone. My girlfriend and I agreed to meet in about 25 minutes at the gate. However, a few minutes later, my buddy comes to my room, white as a ghost, and tells me he believes someone was murdered, and the person took his head or a basketball or something. His room was 50 feet from the phone booth. We went out there and sure enough, a headless person. There was blood and bits of guts everywhere. As we were trying to figure out what was going on, my friend R would describe to me what he saw as he watched the incident from his window. For a while, people thought I was the dead soldier because they had seen me at the phone booth. By the way, a blizzard had just started and visibility was extremely reduced. I ended up having to guard the body that night, and initially in the confusion, we thought it was a German national. And all of a sudden, the S2 runs up with a group of soldiers and tells us to follow. We went to the arms room, gathered weapons, went back to the site, and were told to shoot anyone that gets within 3 feet if they didn't identify themselves, which is about the limit of visibility due to the snowstorm. My thoughts were, oh my gosh, that could have been me. Again, keep in mind, we were drawing down, reducing the base at this point. The barracks were deserted and tensions were high. Usually a bustling area of activity, now the only noises were doors eerily opening and shutting in the wind. We set up to guard the body, now covered by a small tent, in shifts. While I was on one of my shifts, military police or CID types actually brought a sports bag to the tent and it said head on it. I never saw the head, but the bag was bloody and one of the MPs told me that it was the head. I was young and this was one of the strangest, creepiest nights of my life. Something I will never forget. Since the unit was drawing down and leaving Fulda, I would depart in a few weeks to Ilsheim, Germany. I would spend another 1.5 years there and then end up leaving the army, going to college, becoming an officer and a pilot, which is what I wanted to be while in Fulda, but that's a story for another day. I can't wait to share your podcast with friends and family so that at least they don't think I was making this up with hyper imagination. Thanks. There's so many other details to share, but I need to head out. But I'll leave you with these few tidbits. Not posthumously promoting Specialist Glover was Lieutenant Colonel N's call. I remember that well and agreed with his decision. He was a good man. He's talking about the Lieutenant Colonel. The gate guard, an American soldier, one of the guys that I knew, told my German girlfriend that I was the one who was dead. If memory serves me right, it wasn't until several hours later that I was able to tell her that I was okay. I was told that while Diane was on the phone, she heard Glover say, quote, "Shit, it's your husband," end quote, or something along those lines. Glover tried to run away but slipped on ice. That is when Schap mounted him. My friend watched all this happen, and he actually thought they were horsing around. One of my friends and another soldier confronted Schap. They were about to try and subdue him, but that is when he kicked off his head after he sawed and couldn't get it off. He picked it up and said, "That is what you get for committing adultery." The S2, aka the intel officer, told us it was a German national who was attacking Americans because his girlfriend was stolen by a GI. Not sure if this was fog of war, seriously bad intel, or just them holding cards close to the vest to gather facts. Obviously, later we found out it was another soldier. CID came and interviewed me in Ilsheim a few weeks later. I was also there in Fulda when the 1-year-old girl was thrown out the window. I believe there was also an MP who accidentally shot his wife around the same time. Man, it's hard to believe the things that were happening at this unit. Last little nugget of info. I was in the barracks standing at a door, all glass, waiting for someone else to get off the phone because, as I mentioned, it was snowing heavily. I heard an announcement for Specialist Glover to come to the Houdini HHT orderly room. I remember thinking to myself, that's odd, he's an outlaw troop guy. A few minutes later, 2 soldiers ran up and asked if I had seen Glover. I said I had not, but the person on the phone looked like him. They checked and it wasn't him. Then the person on the phone got off and I jumped into the yellow phone booth. After 5 to 10 minutes of speaking with my girlfriend, I turned around and saw Glover waiting. Again, as a common courtesy, I got off, I walked past him and nodded my head toward him as I walked past. A few minutes later, he was dead. Thank you so much, True Crime Army, for all the seasoned and neophyte listeners alike. Y'all truly make my day all the time. It's hard to believe that I've been at this gig for 4.5 years, but here we are. Initially, when I wanted to redo this episode, I thought that maybe you guys would all hate me for doing the case again. But after reading those messages from listeners who experienced this case firsthand, I knew I had to do it. I want to encourage everyone, if you haven't listened to every single episode on my public feed, go back and listen from episode 1. There are some crazy cases that start when I started this podcast in 2019. My sources for this episode remain identical to my first run. Shout out to European Stars and Stripes for capturing the nitty-gritty of the court-martial. I also relied on an appellate court opinion as well as an article written in the Washington Post. Military Murder is a Mama Margot production. This episode was produced by all of you. The music was created by Ty-Ops. If you're interested in supporting this show and listening to more shocking true crimes, be sure to join me on Patreon at patreon.com/militarymurder or an Apple Premium subscription, where for as little as $5, you will have access to a library of over 40 full-length episodes, and you will not hear these episodes on my public feed. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you another military murder story next week.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.